Okay, first on the schedule, remember that the annotated bibliography was technically due today, but you can turn it in later in the week because I know you guys just, I guess, got through with your political science exam. And there have been some delays in things like library visits and CASA visits and things like that that were planned. But the storm last week, or non-storm, but other delays and class cancellations have kind of messed things up a bit. So if you have turned in your annotated bibliography already and you want to, if you sort of say, I think I did something completely wrong, I want to resubmit it, it is set up so that you can submit a second version, and you can add a note to me and tell me to be sure to look at one version instead of the other. If you haven't turned it in, turn it in sometime this week. Try not to get behind. We have a rather lengthy reading for Wednesday. Friday, it's just a video. It's about 20 minutes, but it's one you actually want to take notes on. You don't want to just sort of, let it pass in front of your face and assume you got the content to it. So don't get behind on those, but if you need to take a few more days to finish your annotated bibliography, that's totally fine. We also don't want to get too far behind because on a week from this Wednesday, so the September 29th, is when your first full essay is due. That some people take 2 weeks. You want to have that much time to compose an essay. That's actually a good idea, but because we're kind of pressed for time, I've got a lot of questions that I'm going to go over in class today to try to help you think through your issue. But hopefully that will make the writing process quicker. But another thing that I really want to emphasize is the purpose of this essay is not to answer the question at the core of your issue. The only thing you're going to be doing in this first essay is describing the rhetorical situation around your issue. So, these are the parties involved. These are the common arguments about the issue. This is the event that set it off, that sort of thing. I'm going to go over those, but also, well, if you look at the essay section or the essay project section, it's now at the top. So if you need to get to the annotated bibliography, just scroll down in a second. But there's a long description here. I'm going to go over in more detail what's basically in here. But it's got things like page requirements, the sources you have to have, basically the same as the sources, excuse me, that you turned in your annotated bibliography. They don't have to be, and in fact, you should continue to do research on your issue, get to know the conversation better, just with every passing week especially, and integrate new and better, maybe more relevant sources, and kind of drop out ones that are secondary and unnecessary. Now, some secondary sources are going to be necessary to understanding the conversation, but some are just going to be repeating others that are repeating others that are repeating others without actually adding anything relevant. But I have added down here, two things are like APA guides that were made by the Writing Center here and are actually no longer available at the Writing Center website. I'm not sure why, but I uploaded the PDF for each of those. But the top one here, this list of relevant questions, all of the text that you're going to see on the slides I'm about to show, all of these are listed in this document. So don't feel like you've got to write down all the questions and things like that you see behind me later when I go through the PowerPoint. All of those are in this document that are in the assignment linked under helpful resources. All right, so remember that your issue, whatever it is, first of all, it's more than just a topic. It's a question that needs to be answered or solved, problem that needs to be solved, something like that. That's the difference between an issue and a topic. A topic, you can just sort of aggregate lots of information from a lot of sources, dump it all into one document, and that'll be it. But you want to do more than that with an issue. You want to answer a question. And that means that you're going to find yourself saying something to the effect of, we need to talk about this issue. This is why you're writing about this issue. This is why you're researching this issue. You already see some importance in it just by the fact that you were drawn to it as a potential subject for research. But this question, or this statement, we need to talk about the issue, obviously includes the issue. So the description of the issue is going to be relevant, but you also want to be able to describe why we need to talk about this issue. What is the exigence? Why is it relevant? Why is it something that needs to be talked about? Who is we? Obviously, this is going to be something that's not relevant to a lot of people, but it will be relevant to some people. Some people can actually have something important, informative to say about it. People can actually do something about it. Some people can't do something about it. So who's we? Who is it that's generating statements, writing, speeches, stuff like that? Who's the intended audience? What can that audience say in response? So who's involved in the conversation? Why does that conversation need to happen? And how does that conversation take place? Is this about a law or a bill that's going to be voted into law? Is this about a court decision? Is this about something that you individually can do? Is this something that we want people to put pressure on other agencies like institutions, more powerful entities that can act, but that the rest of us as a larger group can sort of influence to act? Where is this conversation taking place? The conversation about the issue. In what format? Is it taking place on social media? Is it taking place in the general press? Is it taking place in a boardroom somewhere? And what outcome can come from that conversation? All of these elements are going to be relevant to understanding not just the issue itself, but the rhetorical situation that issue is situated in. So I'm going to return to our case study. Nicki Minaj's tweet last week that her cousin or her cousin's friend in Trinidad had, let's say, certain sexual side effects to the COVID vaccine. This has been in the news. It's been in a lot of major news sites. It's been all over social media, been on the comedy shows. Why are people talking about this? She's famous. So a lot of famous people, that's part of it, but it's not all of it. A lot of famous people say a lot of things, especially on social media, that get just completely ignored. So she's famous, that's part of it. And more to the point, maybe she's got 22 million followers, 22.7 million followers. What else makes this an issue?
The vaccine is controversial as of right now.
Controversial how? What does that mean? What were we going to say? Blake?
It's controversial because it hasn't been really out for that long. People aren't really that sure about it, and people are scared that something's going to happen because, it's not been out that long. It hasn't had a lot of time to develop like other vaccines have. So there's definitely a fear that's there.
So we've talked about
It's because the facts that are trying to, or the people's feelings of worrying about the vaccine causing harm is getting in the way of the fact that it's not statistically true in most cases.
And so she's actually kind of validating, or at least she's giving voice to a fear a lot of people have, right? Or at least this makes sense, even if we're going to get into later why it doesn't actually check out. But vaccines in general, or any kind of thing you put in your body, you're kind of worried about, especially if it's something that hasn't been vetted as long as many other things have. There is certain worry, and that worry is something that everybody should share, even people in the medical community, people doing the research. Hopefully, those are the people doing the research should ideally be the ones that are most afraid. So they're going to be the ones that are most rigorous in looking for side effects and things like that. But at this point, the controversy is happening on Twitter, which is different than a controversy happen, or a conversation, a dialogue between people in a research sort of falsification study, or where falsification is the goal. But so it's significant because she's got a lot of followers. She's making a claim that resonates with a lot of people's fears. And so that in itself might make the tweet more widely spread than something where she just said something that people weren't too worried about. What else? What else makes it an issue? So it resonates with people's fears. That's one of the reasons it might get spread more. What about the backlash, or the people that are saying that this is a problem? This tweet is a problem. Why are they saying that? Mhm.
Causes impotence in anyone. So
Yeah, so,
So I'm pretty sure Trinidad probably doesn't have vaccines, right?
oh, they do, yeah, yeah, so the government of Trinidad and Tobago have sort of replied to this, we'll come back to that. But as it's stated right here, it's hearsay, it's, a cousin's friend that reported this. And if this one incident was a common side effect, we would expect more than that. We'll get to later when we talk about the stasis of causation that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. Two things can happen at the same time without one actually causing the other. And this is especially true of like health effects. But this sort of thinking is something that we're more likely to be alert for health effects right after we've had something scary like a vaccination. Whereas we might, if he had the same symptoms without having gotten the vaccination recently, he might not, think it was a big deal, or he might be looking for another cause of that effect. But she's at least implied she's actually gotten frustrated when people said that she didn't get the vaccine because of this. But we at least see an implication of cause and effect there. Well, I mean, she says, when she says his friend got it and became impotent, she doesn't necessarily say he became impotent because of it, but it's just that connection is there. That's a cause for concern. But again, it's hearsay she's basing it on. But yet, if we took all the hearsay off of social media, off of Twitter, and said you can't post anything on Twitter unless you have, verifiable primary sources to document your facts, how much would there be on Twitter? Yeah, there's not going to be a whole lot. What kind of conversation, just verbal conversation, would we be able to have if we had to back up everything we said? I couldn't warn my daughter, don't climb up on that wobbly piece of furniture, because I can't tell statistically what the likelihood is she'll fall off of it and hurt herself. So I can't say don't walk out into a busy street, because she might walk across a busy street and do just fine. No, I've got to make certain generalizations to act on, because remember what Bitzer said about the rhetorical situation. The reason we're talking is because there's a situation in the world we need to deal with. And most of the time, almost all the time, we're going to have to at some point make a generalization based on the facts we've got. So we can't expect somebody to wait until they have every single possible fact verified before they make a claim or say something on Twitter. But all of these are relevant factors, but what else makes this an issue? What's at stake? What if yeah? Mm-hmm. How so?
Because it's people are saying that this has happened. Like, I don't. Because if they think that this is true, they won't take the vaccine, which will make COVID spread, and that will obviously make people sick.
Yeah.
And they will hurt people in the long run.
Yeah. So the consequences of this are, if people listen to it and use that as part of their decision to not get vaccinated, then they're themselves vulnerable to the disease, especially now that the Delta variant is multiple times more transmissible than the original strain. They're putting their own health and potentially lives on the line. They're also potential spreaders. So if you get it, you're much more likely to spread it to other people, not just people who haven't been vaccinated, but even to people who have. This complicates the situation even more, because the Delta variant, unlike the other variants in the original strain of COVID, is something that vaccinated people can get. It's probably not going to put you in the hospital. It's even less likely to actually kill you, but it is something you could then pass on to somebody else, somebody who's not vaccinated, people like my daughter, who's too young to get vaccinated. So I have to be extra careful, even though I'm vaccinated, because it's not just my health that I'm dealing with that decision. So that brings up issues like individual autonomy, individual choice. To what extent do I have to make concessions in order, about my own individual liberty? If I'm worried about the vaccine, can I just say, well, I'm not going to get it, and that's my personal choice? I'm risking my own health, but I'm doing that autonomously. I'm doing that, as an individual choice that affects me, but I'm also potentially, without trying to, I could also then become a spreader. So that issue, that balance between the public good and individual choice is also an issue that is connected here. So we see that this one tweet is at the sort of nexus of a lot of issues: public health, misinformation, vaccine fears, and that sort of thing. So it's a good test case because, if I want to talk about fears of vaccines, I could go back well before COVID ever even appeared. Not just the COVID vaccine, but before that, it was the MMR vaccine. Before that, it was the earliest vaccines that ever existed. Let me see if I have this set up in a certain way. If you remember, or if you know anything about the fears of the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, those fears started really widespread publicly when this guy, Andrew Wakefield, in 1997, published a study where he looked at just 13 children that had gotten the MMR vaccine and had been diagnosed with autism. He actually falsified or fabricated the data so that it looked like they got their first symptoms of autism within a couple of weeks after getting the MMR vaccine. In actuality, some of them had symptoms of autism before they got the MMR vaccine, which makes it kind of hard to show a causal connection if the effects precede the cause. Some of them had their first symptoms of autism years after getting the MMR vaccine. But he published in a peer-reviewed journal, which can't, check to see, are you lying about your data? All they can say is, did you look for enough? Did you, test this rigorously enough? That one study was published in a peer-reviewed journal, and that set off, millions of parents across the world, this fear that they were being lied to, that vaccine companies were covering up the side effects of vaccines like the MMR vaccine. And so the requirement that children get vaccinated in order to go to public school and things like that, for the protection of people who couldn't get vaccinated, like that had immune deficiencies, who had allergic reactions to elements in vaccines and stuff like that, or organ transplants, things like that, compromised immune systems. They couldn't get the vaccine, so they depended on the people around them not to spread things like the measles. Well, the pushback against that caused the measles to return. We had beaten the measles in the U.S. in the 1990s, but now it's back, and it can sometimes be fatal. So that has nothing to do with COVID, that issue, but the issue there is vaccine hesitancy, why people are afraid of vaccinations. Incidentally, you can go all the way back to, you guys know who Ethan Allen is? Not the furniture company, but the original, or one of the guys in the American Revolution that modern day special forces in America look back to as their sort of forefather because of some of his commando raids against the British. He didn't just defy British rule in the US, he also defied religious and political laws against forms of necromancy, like taking blood from one person and then putting it in another person's body. Oh, that's got to be some kind of devil worshiping ceremony there, right? Well, actually, his friend and Dr. Thomas Young, who was one of the original Sons of Liberty, that was, involved in the Boston Tea Party and stuff like that. Before the American Revolution started, they defied a law by doing basically one of the first smallpox vaccinations in American history, when they took blood from a person who had survived smallpox, took blood from that person, which contained, they didn't know exactly how it worked, they just knew that it worked, but it contained dead smallpox viruses, put that into Ethan Allen's body, and because of that, his immune system was able to adapt to those dead pathogens without actually having to deal with the symptoms of the disease itself. In other words, a primitive form of vaccination. So events like that, I can point to those individual events and say, okay, this action had these repercussions. For one thing, it was illegal. Why was it illegal? Because the very idea of a vaccination is kind of creepy. You're taking a pathogen, something that causes a disease, and putting it in someone else's body. Now, it's not exactly how modern vaccines work, but,
They give you the, some sort, like they give you the flu.
Well, it's dead. So there's something in common, like with the COVID vaccine, it's just something that has I don't even know what the word for it is, but basically the way that the virus injects its genetic code into a cell, if your immune system can recognize that sort of appendage, then it can fight off all the variants, with the exception of the Delta variant, and even that it can fight a little bit. But yeah, there's something about that pathogen, even if it's dead, even if it's just one part of the pathogen without the other parts, that your immune system can recognize and then prepare to fight in the future, identify it and remove it in the future. But yeah, early vaccines were actually like, the actual vaccine or the actual pathogen itself. So you can see why that kind of causes this inherent fear, especially if, I can't even explain how vaccines work right now. So putting something that unknown into your body is in itself this sort of scary thing. And then, of course, people are associated with epistemic communities where vaccine hesitancy is completely unjustified, right? But also, you're associated with epistemic communities where it makes total sense. Everybody that you know that you're getting good parenting advice from, say, other parents that if you're a new parent, you're sort of not even sure like what to do in this situation or that situation. Your community is going to help you find a lot of accurate answers, but they're also going to lead you toward inaccurate answers. And it's very difficult to fact check every piece of advice you get from members of your community. Remember the misinformation age chapter you read pointed out that our sources of misinformation are the same sources as most of our sources of accurate information. And if we're skeptical of everything, we're going to miss out on a lot of helpful advice. So elements like these are part of this issue. I could use Nicki Minaj's quotation to talk about the difficulty of a parent or an individual trying to find information and having to decide, do I listen to my community or do I listen to just the medical community? And does the medical community really comprehend how much anxiety is attached to the idea of vaccination? And does just sort of saying, no, that anxiety is not justified is, have you ever been afraid of something and just told yourself, well, my fear is irrational? And does the fear just go away at that point? We can't just sort of say like, you're wrong to be afraid of this and expect people to change their minds. So that, yeah? Yeah, just tell yourself it's just a spider, it can't kill you. A few species can, but those species like, live in like tropical South America and
90% of all spiders.
yeah. So just assume that, and incidentally, like a black widow can kill you, and you can tell if there's a black spider, you can see the little black widow mark. If you look at it really, really closely, I mean, you got to pick it up and like pull its legs apart and that kind of thing, and just hope you don't get bitten in the meantime. Yeah, so usually the default response is a false positive pattern recognition. Remember that term? Just act as if it's a threat, because if it's not a threat and you overreact, oh, well, you look silly. But if you don't react and it is a threat, you could die. Vaccine hesitancy might work the same way, in which case it's a totally legitimate and evolved overreaction that is, in general, in many cases, actually functional. Another issue is the illusion of knowledge and the internet. One of the things she did in a tweet immediately before that, she said, the reason she didn't go to the Met Gala is because she had to get vaccinated. Well, that was one of the requirements to go, but she said, that's not why. If I get vaccinated, it won't be for the Met. It'll be once I feel I've done enough research. So is she working with the CDC, or is she going to a laboratory and looking at, is she looking at data on the number of people that get vaccinated and their health effects from COVID versus the number of people that don't get vaccinated? What does she mean by research? Yeah, she's got one of those Google machines. And I put Joe Rogan's face up here every time I talk about the illusion of knowledge, just because, like, if you ever watch an episode of Joe or listen to an episode of Joe Rogan, it's like, oh, here's this thing I heard. I don't remember where that was, and I forget the producer's name. But he'll tell his producer, like, look that up. And his producer will like Google it and then find out of like the first 10 Google results which one seems to be the most reliable source. So it's like history.com or Discover magazine or something like that. But remember, in our example last week with the tryptophan neuroscience, neurobunk study, those kind of sources can get things wrong a lot. So, but the thing is, the internet makes us feel like we have access to all this information and we know what to do with it. But remember, things like the illusion of knowledge, it only happens when we try to explain something that we realize how little we actually understand it. If we're looking to confirm a suspicion we already have, the internet will help you. If you have a suspicion the earth is flat, the internet will provide you with evidence that will confirm that. If you believe that lizard people are trying to use the COVID vaccine to inject microchips into your brain so they can control your mind, somebody on the internet will provide you with something that is, at least not incompatible with that belief. So confirmation bias, soldier mindset, all of those things that we use to make things that feel like arguments, that protect our need for closure or a feeling of closure, the feeling that like, I know what I need to know. Things that will look like arguments are there and available, but will not actually lead you closer to the truth. They can actually lead you further away, making you feel more confident without actually being more accurate. But you see this a lot when people just on social media talk about, I need to do research, or people should do their own research. Don't listen to the CDC, don't listen to scientists, don't listen to medical journals and peer-reviewed publications. Do your own research with the Google machine, or just tweets from your cousin's friend, or about somebody's cousin's friend. And again, this is not just Nicki Minaj. This is part of the reason that the event of her tweets got us talking about this, is because this is a much larger scale phenomenon. I mean, Jenny McCarthy used to say the exact same thing about the MMR vaccine. There's also what we've identified in the past as Brandolini's law, or the bullshit asymmetry principle. That is, the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than the energy needed to produce it. That's a sort of pseudo-scientific, mathematical sounding principle enunciated by Alberto Brandolini. But basically, we saw this happen in real time last week. Nicki Minaj makes this tweet. The American press sees it, and they say, okay, we'll call the Ministry of Health in Trinidad and Tobago and see if that's true. Well, you can tweet something that's completely made up or just sounds like it might be true. And you can do that in a couple of seconds. But for them, before they could ever say no, that what she said is not true, they have to then go back and check with their medical community. They have to get doctors and nurses across the country, that's a small country with a small population, but even still, they all have to stop what they're doing, at least some part of their day, respond back to the Ministry of Health, say that, do you have any cases reported that include sexual side effects to the vaccine? And to make sure that they don't, they have to wait around and make sure everybody reports in. And then the Ministry of Health can come on international television and say, no, we don't have any reports like that. But as the Minister of Health said in the interview, this has been such a waste of time. This has taken us all day, and it's caused us to divert our attention away from people in the hospital that actually need the attention of those doctors and nurses. So her tweet, again, not that was her goal or anything like that, but it was an example of this larger problem. In that case, the issue didn't have anything to do with COVID. It was all about misinformation versus fact checking, how much more difficult it is to fact check something than it is to generate it. And again, this is something that if you are in the CDC and you want to get out accurate information, this is something the CDC has been looking into for the last 20 years because of the MMR misinformation out there. They thought, okay, we can just create a list of information like this, like here's why you should get the MMR vaccine, and here's what happens if you don't get it, and here's what happens to children that get the measles and this kind of thing. If we just give people the information, they'll change their minds and get vaccinated, right? But they didn't. And in some cases, people would actually double down on the misinformation. Sometimes they would think, oh, this is the conspiracy trying to brainwash us. This is the pharmaceutical for-profit industry trying to sell their product, and this is the CDC just works for them. In principle, those kinds of fears are not unjustified, But just like any suspicions, you want to look for, some sort of evidence for that. You can't just sort of be randomly skeptical of everything. If you dismiss the sources of potential misinformation, you also dismiss the sources of accurate information. So how can the public health experts actually change people's minds? Well, we saw that the White House offered to communicate to some degree with Nicki Minaj, possibly because they wanted to take a source of misinformation and turn her into a source of accurate information. So they, I guess, contacted her somehow, but then she tweeted, the White House invited me, and I think it's a step in the right direction. I'll be dressed in all pink, like Legally Blonde, so they know I mean business. I'll ask questions on behalf of the people who have been made fun of for simply being human. Well, she says it like she's been invited to go to the White House, but then Jim Psaki said, well, we communicated with her, but it wasn't about like coming to the White House. It was about, we'll put her in contact with some of our medical, experts, and she could ask whatever questions she wants, but it won't necessarily be like, in the White House with Joe Biden there and that sort of thing. Not that Joe Biden would be necessary to that conversation anyway. And that kind of backfired because then people said, whoa, you lied about being invited to the White House. And she was like, no, I didn't. They're just trying to make me look crazy. This is what they do when somebody expresses doubts about vaccines. This is all part of a propaganda campaign against me. So that kind of, I always use this picture of Fauci. I probably will long after people have forgotten who he is, because this is kind of the state you get into when you try to communicate from a epistemic community focused on falsification, try to communicate with people who have other heuristics they use to decide what's true, what's false, what's healthy, what's not. But this is another case study in how the attempts to communicate accurate information can backfire. You don't need to know that in red. We've seen these before, but informational conformity. We've talked about in the past, where just the fact that you've heard something somewhere before makes it seem more true, or at least, I don't remember where I heard this, but I heard somewhere there were sexual side effects of the COVID vaccine. You might not be as skeptical if you've forgotten where you heard it as you would be if you just read it and you knew, okay, that's Nicki Minaj saying that, and it's her cousin's friend, supposedly. So I might be more suspicious of that when I'm remembering the source. But later I might forget the source, and I just remember that I've heard something about sexual side effects. So I forget to be skeptical. And also the illusory truth effect is the more often you hear something, the more true it seems. So these factors also contribute to why a social media post could actually change people's beliefs, even if those people, if they stop to be skeptical, stop to reflect on it, would actually say, okay, that's not a good source of information. All right, so all of this, like none of this actually was me saying you should get vaccinated. Notice, when talking about her tweet and the repercussions, the issues connected to it and that sort of thing, I didn't have to stop and say, like, the point of all that wasn't me saying like you should get vaccinated. It wasn't saying that Nicki Minaj is a bad person who's spreading disinformation. It wasn't that Twitter needs to be responsible for the misinformation it spreads on its platform or something like that. There are a lot of these other issues where I could step in and say something like that, but I realize this is a complicated situation. I realize that this conversation is already in progress, and before I step in and say, here's the right answer, I want to be sure I understand the conversation. That's the point of your first essay. Your first essay is going to be identifying the rhetorical situation, the issue, but also the rhetorical situation it's in, sort of for your own benefit and for your audience. For the first essay, you're in the position of that person who just walked into the conversation. Before you say, here's what I think about this, first you want to stop, listen, and say, okay, what are the dominant arguments I'm hearing in this conversation? What does this group think? Who's organized behind this conclusion? Who's organized behind this other conclusion? What fears does this group have? What cautions does this group have? What sort of epistemology does this group have? What heuristics are they operating on? I'm trying to understand the issue, but also understand the people who are talking about it. What are their motivations? Are some people in there just bullshitting because they don't actually know and don't have a way to know what the accurate facts are? In other words, are they communicating for reasons other than accurate information? I'm not saying Nicki Minaj was, but she did make this comment in one tweet. Let's see. Oh yeah, the Jimmy Kimmel one. Jimmy Kimmel said he wanted to interview Nicki Minaj's cousin's friend, and Nicki responded, he's willing to talk for the right price. Okay, wait a second. If your goal here is to ask the right questions for the people, as she said in another tweet, where does this right price thing come in? So there are motivations other than the accurate communication of information. We should also be suspicious of the pharmaceutical industry as well. There are a lot of drugs out there that make a lot of profit that kind of sort of solve some problems in some cases, but they get overprescribed, not because they're necessary or even really, judicious in all of these cases, but just because the pharmaceutical representative will go to your doctor's office and carry a stack of brochures, not peer-reviewed studies, not publications, but just brochures that say, hey, if you see this symptom, like, do you get stressed? Well, take this pill. We know that whoever you are, you get stressed sometimes. That doesn't mean this pill is going to help you. So always be suspicious, but again, if you're suspicious of everybody all the time, you're not going to learn anything. So to help you narrow down and focus your essay, you want to establish within your issue, first of all, what is the situation that made it relevant? Like I tried to tell people earlier, if you just want to write, if you want to do your research project on abortion, there's so many directions you could go with that, and such a level of generality that you would be stuck at if you're writing a 5-page paper that you're never really going to be able to do anything other than repeat common talking points that are already well known. But if you said, okay, the recent Texas law that makes it possible to sue a woman, but not a man, like not a husband or somebody else involved in an abortion, but a woman who has an abortion after the 6th week of pregnancy, that is a very specific, like, legal issue that is also connected to this larger issue, like the controversy over abortion. It doesn't say anything about, like, when does life begin? Is conception a good place to say an individual becomes a human life, or is it just one step in a process toward personhood that happens later on? Like, none of that is addressed in that law. So it's not technically relevant to solving that problem. Like, is it constitutional or not? That's what the Supreme Court voted on. Not whether they thought it was good, but whether they thought it violated people's constitutional rights. So that Texas law and going to the Supreme Court and being upheld by the court, that would be the events that make this specific issue relevant right now. Obviously, like COVID, because it's still, still something that's spreading all over the place, including right here, makes it relevant. That makes all the connected issues like vaccination and vaccine hesitancy and that sort of thing relevant. But something like, polio and the polio vaccine might not be relevant unless you tie it to the recent COVID outbreak. So that might be a reason to go back and do research into how the polio vaccine was, popularized, and why we didn't have some of the same controversies back then that we're having now. But tie your larger issue to some specific event. That will make it much easier to sort of focus in on what you need to talk about. When it comes to climate change, you want to talk about something like increased hurricane strength and tied to global, or tied to water temperature in the Gulf of Mexico, things like that. When it comes to legalization of marijuana, if you write a paper about legalization now that sounds exactly like a legalization paper written 10 years ago, you're leaving out a whole lot of really relevant information. And that is the states that have legalized the recreational use of marijuana over the past 10 years. And there's still a lot of pushback from the federal government in that area. But I mean, if you just talk about legalization arguments at a really general level, it's not going to sound like anything has changed over the last 10 years. So you want to look at specific laws, specific court decisions, specific controversies that have happened more recently, and tie your issue to that specific situation. The situation might be simple or complex. Remember, simple, like, getting, like, does the COVID vaccine work? Well, before the Delta variant, that was a pretty simple question. But now it's more complicated, because even if you're vaccinated, you can still get the Delta variant. probably won't suffer from it as much, but you can still spread it. Not quite as often, or not quite as in high doses, or the viral load that you spread wouldn't be nearly as much as if you were unvaccinated, but you still can potentially spread it. So if I was to get the Delta variant of COVID, I might not suffer from it much, but I could pass it on to my daughter, who's too young to get vaccinated. So a simple situation has become a more complex situation. Is the situation structured or unstructured? This is extremely important in legal issues. A lot of times, there will be a bill that sounds like a great bill that Congress should definitely vote for, except the other party attached a rider to that bill. That is an amendment to the bill that has nothing to do with the thing covered by the rest of the bill. It's just something that that political party wants in addition. And then all of a sudden, the bill that, you know, the person who actually proposed the bill might actually have to vote against it, because the structure of the bill process, the process of voting on a bill, has actually made it a more complicated issue than just saying, like, you know, the basic idea of the bill is good. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like, point out, like, the example of that's happening in France, which was.
Oh, there's lots. I hadn't even thought of a specific example recently, but there's lots of examples. Yeah.
For this, our COVID relief bill that we got,
Uh-huh.
there was another one that was out that everybody was talking about, but it was all talking about, like, but in it, there was a bunch of stuff about, like, donations to, like, Egypt and stuff,
Oh yeah.
like other places that we needed to not really focus on. So
Uh-huh.
we were about to get stuff done.
Yeah.
But then, like, there was a bunch of other stuff that was, like, totally uninvolved. So now then nobody wanted to, like, go through with it, since in it there's a whole bunch of stuff that was just kind of pointless.
Yeah. I mean, but like I said, they refer to it as, like, a lot of times like a pork bill or something like that, because, you know, back when, you know, that was pork futures were a big part of the investment portfolio. You know, this is centuries old, but it's part of the structure of our legal process. This is how a bill becomes a law. Riders can be added on to these bills. That's part of the structure. So a lot of times you can then see somebody pointing to a politician saying, he voted against this bill to, you know, protect babies from bears. You know, who could, you know, oppose a bill that protects babies from bears? Well, you know, what they forgot to mention was there was this rider on there that made, you know, something completely non-related, added that on. So you got to look at the structure of the situation. What can be done, and how does the structure limit the possible things that can be done? Is the situation temporary or long-lasting? In Lloyd Bitzer's article about the rhetorical situation, he uses a lot of examples like the JFK assassination and how does the next president respond. Obviously, that it was a temporary issue, not something Joe Biden had to deal with. Like, how do I deal with the fact that JFK was assassinated? But just because a situation is temporary, don't take that to feel like it's not relevant. It's not something you want to write about. You might write about something that is completely resolved by the time you finish the essay process at the end of the semester. That's totally fine. And a lot of times, you know, it's only after the event has happened that we kind of look back in an investigation, like the investigations into the January 6th riots and stuff like that. Don't worry that your issue is too temporary. All right. What is the exigence? Why is this important? What is it that needs to change? What is the real world situation that needs to change, and what can actually change? And alternatively, do we want to prevent something from happening? What's at stake? What's the danger here? Is it something that's just going to happen? It's not a big deal. You know, who's affected by it? Are people aware of the problem? Do some people underestimate it? Do some people overestimate it? So if it's something like climate change, people might be thinking, oh, well, who cares if it's going to be a couple degrees hotter in a few years? Might be a little bit less comfortable, but no, the problem there is actually being able to grow food. If the summers are hotter and the winters are colder, that's going to kill a lot more of our crops. If the Gulf of Mexico is warmer, that's going to mean faster and more frequent hurricanes, that sort of thing. Who's affected? Oh, but also the flip side of that is somebody making an issue out to be way more important or way more harmful than it actually would be. You might say, okay, this situation is a problem, but it's not as big a problem as some people are making. And again, all these questions are in that document I've attached to the assignment. But very important for your sources, identify who is talking about this issue. Whether you agree with them or not, you're not just looking for sources that support one particular take on the issue. You want to have at least 2 sources, maybe more, that provide different perspectives, even if those perspectives are wrong. I want to understand why Nicki Minaj and other people who support her are afraid of vaccines. I'm never going to be able to communicate with them until I understand the legitimate premises that they're operating under. Now, there are going to be some non-legitimate premises, like the lack of evidence. But there's a lot about their argument that is legitimate, and I want to validate that and understand it so that I can then have that conversation. What epistemic communities are the speakers or writers coming from? Are they only talking to people that are also in their epistemic communities? Are they operating beyond that? Where do they get their facts? So you want to at least be able to establish something about your issue based on either a peer-reviewed source or a sort of raw data source, like data.gov or something like that, where you're getting the information without inferences attached, without people saying these facts are facts in the general terms and then saying, well, because of that, we need to do this. That's generalization followed by inference. That's not what you want. You want raw data for at least some part of your issue. What are their values? We're going to spend the next 2 days talking about these terms like consequentialist and deontological and the different moral foundations. We'll come back to that on Wednesday and Friday, but I'm just throwing that in there so you know it's there. Who is the audience? In other words, who are the speakers or writers talking to? What constraints are they under? What do they know or not know? So if Anthony Fauci is talking to Nicki Minaj, he can't just quote a lot of statistics and talk about the null hypothesis in science and that sort of thing. He has to talk to her in terms that she will understand, and then actually understand what her situation is. Conversely, or beyond that, sometimes we'll tell people things they understand, but in terms that they don't really see is necessary to act on, that sort of thing. And then your thesis needs to be unified. It needs to be a response to a single question, not just a report. So see if your overall theme can be, why is this issue an issue? How did it get to this point? What is the history of this issue? That sort of thing. You're not just sort of saying, here's lots of elements about this issue, and then having no coherent thesis. All of this stuff should be unified by your answer to a question like, why is this issue a problem right now? Or why are people taking this seriously? Or are people mistaking an individual rights issue for a public goods issue, or something like that. All right, so if you've got questions, let me know now. If you've got questions about your annotated bibliography, you can ask me now or you can email me about it. But try to keep up, even if you're still working on the annotated bibliography, try to keep up with the readings, and we'll talk about Steven Pinker's New York Times article on Wednesday. If you can't get access to the New York Times because you've already used up your 5 limit or whatever, there's a PDF attached, so you can use that one. You should be able to get that whole article. It's an important article. It's a lot in it, so be sure you give yourself time to digest it. All right, see you Wednesday. You too.